Good morning, good evening, and good day, and welcome to another webinar from Global E-commerce Experts. Today, we're talking to in a completely different way, in fact, as we have done before. You'll know if you're a regular listener to watcher of GE's webinars that we talk a lot about European expansion. But we're very lucky this evening to be joined by Kevin Sanderson, who's the host of Maximizing E-commerce, which is a series of podcasts and YouTube channel, who's going to give us some expert insight into Amazon Canada. So this is a really exciting additional opportunity that we just can't miss. So Kevin's going to give us a good run through of that. So for this evening's agenda, we'll talk a little bit about why Canada and the opportunity that comes along, the process, some rather nasty recent inventory issues, which Kevin will talk through, and the kind of blueprint to a successful Canadian launch. So welcome to all. My name is Ricky Hooker, a general manager at Global E-commerce Experts. You'll know the well-trodden path of GE's 6-step guide to expanding into the EU, but it felt to us that it shouldn't just be about the EU, and we should explain and give some detail on opportunities from a wider perspective. A lot of our customers and clients are expanding from the US into Europe, and we wanted to make sure that along that journey they hadn't missed another exciting and expanding opportunity almost right on their doorstep in figurative speech rather than just geographic. So Kevin, welcome and thank you for joining us. Let's perhaps if you could do a little brief introduction of you and tell us a little bit more about how we can go about expanding into Canada.
Yes, well, Ricky, thank you for having me. This is quite the honor. I love the conversations that come up when we talk about expanding into international marketplaces. So much, I think, in the U.S. where I'm at. So I'm in Florida. I was actually, just before we hit the broadcast button, we were talking about I would give you a gold star if you knew where I'm located, and you actually did, because you've been to the county where I live in, which is not a well-known place in Florida necessarily. So I was super impressed with your worldly skills there. But kudos to you guys also for putting these presentations on, because too many people miss out on the opportunities to expand into global marketplaces. Because really what you got to think of it as, if you're selling on Amazon in the US, eventually you're going to hit a ceiling where the products that you're selling, if you want to grow, you can either sell more products or you can sell to more people. And in the US, maybe you find another long tail keyword that's going to give you a couple sales a month or something else. But if you want to really grow, you got to start going wider and go into other marketplaces. And here in the US, a lot of folks like to look at it as, well, let me go over there. And so across the pond becomes very attractive to folks, and they forget about the our friendly neighbors to the north in Canada. And I live in Florida. I'm been in the US pretty much my entire life. I've been to Canada one time, and it was actually, we drove south from Detroit, because Detroit, Michigan is actually right on a river into, I think it's Windsor, Ontario, where you kind of go south to get there. And so one afternoon we went to a casino, and that's my one time in Canada. So point being, you don't have to live in Canada. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge about Canada. All you got to know is the process. And so that's what we'll talk about today, is the process of selling in Canada. So
okay, well, look, before you get going,
let's do
Kevin,
it.
Let's run a poll on the
Okay.
the attendees who are in today, just to find out who of our attendees are trading in Canada at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to start a poll off here, folks, that you can take a look at, just to get a bit of a view for who's trading, and that can help to perhaps to control the types of questions we'll have later.
Sure.
And the way that you might be talking to people.
Sounds good.
So that's coming through now. Let's leave that running for a bit. If you want to get going, and I'll give you the results shortly.
Yeah. And one of the things I came to learn very quickly, going back to the whole idea of casting a wider net and going wider, was when I was selling. I started off at a full-time job. I was selling at Amazon in the U.S. kind of as a side hustle. About 3 years later, I ended up leaving it to go full-time and do other things. But what I came to realize very quickly was Canada is so simple to add additional sales. For a lot of people, believe it or not, Canada sales oftentimes are rivaling their sales in the UK. Canada is a very, which we'll get into, I guess, more of the why sell in Canada here in a moment. But I believe in the UK, there's become a saying, it's become famous of next slide, please, because I guess the Prime Minister does presentations to the citizenry of the UK saying next slide. So what we're going to talk about here is mostly from the standpoint of getting launched. And the way I like to have the mindset of it is you want to be set up and running by the time your next inventory shipment arrives. So if you placed an order today, if you're talking about, let's say 30 days for the product, maybe another couple weeks for the shipments. So depending on what that time frame looks like, it's not unrealistic that if you ordered a product today, you could have all the registrations and much of what you needed to do to sell in Canada. So you could have everything set up ready to go so that you just send stuff in as soon as you have the inventory. So I guess we'll get to the next slide here in a moment. So this is a screenshot, not from right now. So right now, if you're following Canada, you probably hear all this like chatter, people not happy, myself included, with some of the inventory restrictions, which we'll get to more about here in a moment. But just to kind of see the big picture. So sales are growing, not just in the US, not just in the UK, they're growing pretty much everywhere. And people are willing to pay for things. One of the things that's interesting about Canada is if you look here, you can see, so this is the 30 days leading up to Christmas Eve. So this is obviously a very busy time period. But when you look, there's the year over year sales number. So you can see the growth. So units went up by 26%. So that's a healthy growth, multiple double digits year over year. But then the dollars, so they use dollars, it's different than US dollars, but they have Canadian dollars. And it went up 45% year over year. And some of it was, I just started raising prices and people were happy to pay it. One thing that's interesting about Canada is it's like the US, where their sales tax, they, for the most part, call it GST, HST. I'm grossly oversimplifying it here. But basically, the way it works is GST, HST is added on top of the selling price. So your selling price, you don't have to worry about including, taxes within the margin of what you're selling it for. And people oftentimes will pay more for the comparable product in Canada than they would elsewhere. And one of the things that's interesting is there was an article I read in Business Insider that Vancouver, Canada, believe it or not, according to their methodology, was the #2 most expensive city in the world after Hong Kong. And then Toronto, Montreal, a lot of those cities in Canada are very expensive. And then you also think about Canada, it's the second largest, I almost said city, it's almost the second largest country by landmass. It's enormous. But most people tend to live within 100 miles of the US border, so their culture is very similar. And one of the things that's very interesting about Canada is somebody might live out in the boondocks. And so that's our kind of US term for they live in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. And so the way it's been described to me by people that live in Canada is somebody might like be in rural Alberta and they're out in the middle of nowhere, and they can either drive an hour to a general store with maybe 1,000 products, 1,000 total SKUs, or they can find anything they want on their phone, click a button, and it magically arrives in a couple of days. So they're willing to pay a little bit of a premium for that convenience. So just in general in Canada, even relative to, when you factor in the difference in currency, people are usually willing to pay a little bit extra within reason, of course. But Canada, it's, Amazon's got a footprint there. I mean, that's a picture there of their prime minister shaking hands with an Amazon associate in one of the fulfillment centers. There's definitely Amazon has a foothold there. just as many things in Canada have similar cultures to the US. They're, for any Canadians listening, I recognize that Canada is a very sovereign country and it has much of its own culture. I love the French fries with the gravy and stuff like that on it that they have there. So I know that Canada is its own country, but it's definitely got a good foothold there. So a few other reasons to sell in Canada is there is less competition. So oftentimes, if you think about it this way, the population of Canada is about a tenth of the U.S. population. It's not uncommon for sellers from the U.S. during normal times to get about 10 to 20% of their US sales they would see in Canada on a comparable catalog of products. Because what ends up happening is a lot of people are scared to try something different because, oh, there's compliance you have to figure out. Well, we'll get into this, and I'm disclaimer, not a lawyer, not an accountant. I don't play any of that on TV, but I definitely want to paint the picture that it's not. It's like going to the dentist. It's usually in our minds that's going to be more painful than what it really is. So hopefully this would be a good visit to the dentist, saying it that way. And another thing is, for the most part, it's English speaking. I don't even know where you would translate a French listing to, put it in French. And so for the most part, the way I understand it, if you went to Amazon.ca as a, let's say, French Canadian speaker, you would have to actually change your settings that a robot would be moving it into to French. And so for the most part, the customers there are speaking English, and the people that go there are looking for English products.
Is there any legal obligation to provide it in French like there is in some of the towns and cities?
Good question. So there's the black and white answer, and then there's the what actually happens in practice. So again, not an attorney, so don't take advice because you heard somebody on a webinar. But from the way it's been described to me, no one actually cares. And so, and I've pretty much seen this. And Amazon doesn't even have any requirements that they have of like, you must have packaging in both languages. If there's something that goes through the government, like if you sell supplements, you might be required by Health Canada. If you need, let's call a natural products number, you might be required to have some French on the label. But for the most part, if it's not being touched by the government and it's not an official thing, like the government has to do everything in both languages. But for your average run-of-the-mill product that someone would be selling on Amazon, there's generally not a requirement for French. Well, let's just say, in practice, I've never once had a complaint from someone, even when I sometimes will get emails in French from customers. No one has ever complained that, hey, your listings, your instructions, whatever, aren't in French. And I've never heard of a seller being told that or having anything flagged. With a disclaimer, that could all change tomorrow because it is the official. But I think in practice, the government looks at it as, they had their prime minister there at a fulfillment center. They look at it as this is a win for, it's creating jobs, it's creating convenience for Canadian citizens. People get access to products they might not have had otherwise. So no, I don't think anybody really is like out there policing packaging. I'll just say that.
What about, we'll come into questions later. What about the A+ content? Do you think that would help?
You could. I tend to believe that for the most part, people are going on the marketplace to purchase who are English speakers. You could theoretically, if you thought there was a presence, to put, maybe some words in French in your back end keywords, or maybe your alt tags for A+ content. But I tend to not worry about the French part of it, is usually the way I suggest to folks. It sounds like one of those things that would be really helpful, but when you think about the 80-20 of all the things you could be doing, I don't know how much sales it would be driving. Now, somebody could test that and prove me wrong, and I would be open to hearing that. So culture is very similar to the US culture, but again, they've got They've got very distinct things. They love their hockey. They're super nice. Sometimes Americans will get offended if I say something that stereotypes Canadians, but Canadians, every time I've ever said that Canadians are nice, I usually get emails and messages thanking me for recognizing that, because they take a lot of pride in it, generally speaking. Canada is, very similar culture to the US, but they are distinct. The inventory logistics are pretty simple. So oftentimes what will end up happening is folks will import goods into the US, and then they'll send some of it up to Canada whenever it arrives. And so maybe it goes to a third party warehouse in the US and holds back a little bit of it before it goes into the US fulfillment centers. And then they'll send some up to Canada. And sometimes people will say, but yeah, there's additional costs for the shipping. And I tend to not worry too much about that, because oftentimes you can pass along that additional cost and still retain your same margins in the US, because people are willing to pay a little bit extra. And again, the sales tax is similar to the US, although it's simpler. So pretty much without a doubt, you would need to register for GST, HST, that's the goods and services tax, and the harmonized sales tax, which is, let's just call it sales tax. It's added on in most provinces, and you just have to file if you have less than 1.5 million Canadian dollars in sales. Then you only have to file once a year. And so it's super, super simple. There's like 6 boxes. There's very little calculation you have to worry about. All right. So just to kind of compare the marketplaces. So the US population, roughly 330 million, Canadian population, roughly 37 million. So as I was saying, it's around 10%, a little bit higher than that. But compared to the population, generally speaking, people will see higher numbers of sales relative to the population. Both countries call their currency the dollar. The Canadian dollar is a little bit different in price. So it's almost like it tends to be whatever direction the pound is to the dollar, it's like the opposite way from the dollar, the US dollar to the Canadian dollar. So just keep that in mind when you're converting things and you're trying to figure out your pricing. Sales tax is added on top of the selling price in the US. Your prices over there do not include GST, HST. Amazon will, generally speaking, if you put your registration numbers in there, generally speaking, what they're going to do is they're going to collect from the customer based on where the customer lives, and then they just include it in your disbursements. And then at the end of the year, you'd be responsible for remitting that to the government, which is new to a lot of sellers. Although I live in Florida, Florida is not a marketplace facilitator state. So I am required to, there's no way around me to argue that I have Nexus in the state of Florida. So I have to basically file every month with the state of Florida. And so it's kind of like that in Canada. There are 4 provinces where there are a provincial sales tax. And so the way many sellers tend to look at it, this is a business decision as to whether or not they register in those 4 provinces. And so if somebody was registered in, let's say, Florida, Kansas, Missouri, and the other non-marketplace facilitator states in the US, oftentimes they'd be the same people that register in the provincial sales tax states, or provinces, I should say. But the opposite tends to hold true too. That's for folks to do whatever they would like with that knowledge. But GST, HST is one of those that there's no reason not to register for, because it's almost like a hybrid of US sales tax and VAT, in the sense that you pay GST, HST at the border and you get that back as a credit. Over there in Canada, your fulfillment fees are taxable. So they're going to have a GST, HST added on top of it. That is also a credit. So in essence, as long as you're registered and you give Amazon your registration number, they will add the GST, HST on top. So you'll get that. And then when you go to file, you'll be able to subtract out the things that you were going to have to pay for anyway, like the GST, HST on top of the fulfillment fees and what you pay at the border. So your customer is paying you back for those fees that you were paying on, or they're paying you back for the GST, HST, I should say, that you were paying elsewhere. So, but that wouldn't happen if you weren't registered. So that should help. So I guess on to the next one here. So the process of launching into Canada, it's probably very similar to how you guys say. I might just use some different wording. First off, you want to validate that there's sales potential. I tend to look at it, and this is pretty much any marketplace. Look and see, are there any sales for similar products? And if there is, it's worth testing. You can always start with small amounts. And if you run out, there's no inventory police that's going to come to you and say, I can't believe you ran out. You're a failure. No, you have data to make informed decisions. Then once you figure out, like, okay, this is actually something that has the potential of selling, then you want to register with the Canadian Revenue Agency. And what you would do is you would register for the GST, HST, as well as you would register for import export. So their import export program. So it's kind of like in the UK where you get a VAT number and then you get an EORI number attached to it. There they give you a 9-digit business number, and then attached to the business number you would get 2 programs, essentially the GST, HST number and the import export number. The only difference between the two is one ends in RT001, one ends in RM001. Very simple. Then you're going to add your listings. Now, one of the nice things is for US-based sellers, if you use the same, if this is FBA, if you use the same SKU you use in the US, then you can keep the same FN SKU. So that means you don't have to relabel it, because oftentimes when you go to a place like Europe, because it's a separate geographical region, Amazon's going to end up giving you a separate FN SKU. Whereas here, because it's all within North America, you can keep the same FN SKU. So that makes it simpler, going back to simpler logistics. That's another reason. So when you're ready, you can send an inventory. Right now, which we'll get to in a moment, their inventory numbers are absolutely crazy. But if you started registering for GST, HST, and you filled out the forms and it took 4 to 6 weeks to get your numbers, the situation might be radically different between now and then. So I say plow through, plan for the future, and then figure out the inventory logistics when you get there. And then you want to maximize the currency. And so, there's different strategies to do that. I like to keep some money back in Canadian dollars so that when I remit it to the government at the end of the year, I'm not having to worry about like converting it into US dollars and then converting it back into Canadian dollars to then pay the government. So then I'm, be losing in currency transaction fees essentially for converting it twice. So I like to keep some back. And then you want to manage your international business and just grow it. And so the interesting thing is, I like to look at it as, if I know for a lot of people watching this, they might already be in Europe. But if you're not, Canada is a great starter platform. If Europe seems kind of scary, Canada, it's relatively simple. The nice thing is, if you call the government with questions, they're so helpful. They're so friendly. They're, without a doubt, and I say this with no disrespect in case anyone from any government agency is watching us right now, the Canadian Revenue Agency is probably the friendliest, most helpful government help desk line I've ever spoken to. And like, they genuinely will take time to explain things to you. They just have this spirit, like they're trying to help you out. They're not trying to play gotcha or anything. So, I won't say names of maybe departments or agencies that have, at least in the US, a connotation of, if you go to a certain office, you might talk to someone who has no idea what they're talking about, and then you talk to someone else and they give you a completely different answer. There, they tend to be very consistent. So Canada is a great place to start. But then once you get the process and you get your foot wet going elsewhere, then you can start looking into other marketplaces. Now, you've probably heard me talk now about the inventory issues. And so Canada right now is going through some challenges. So just to give a little bit of context, remember last year when in the US, we were not allowed to send in units for a few weeks. It was maybe 6 weeks or so. Like, I couldn't send anything in because it was quote unquote non-essential. Well, it was essential to me, but it wasn't essential to Amazon, because it was basically like the sky was falling with the onset of COVID. They didn't have as many challenges over there in Canada last year, but they seem to be having them now. And so I think one of the big things that happened was the Brampton, Ontario fulfillment center, because there's not as many fulfillment centers in Canada as there are in the US or even the UK. And so when basically their biggest fulfillment center on the eastern side of the country had to close down for 2 weeks, pretty much unplanned. They couldn't send anyone in. They couldn't move inventory out. Basically, the local health officials said, you just have to close down and basically quarantine. I guess based on the number of people that might have gotten COVID that, worked there. And so I think they're back open, but we'll get to an article here in a moment. But they've really drastically reduced it. And so I had been down to about 700 and something units that I was allowed to send into Canadian fulfillment centers, which before there was no limits at the account level. There were there was no IPI score. Now there's an IPI score. Now we have these crazy limits that you can see there. That's actually from last night screenshot I took on my account where I'm limited to 200 units. So I'm 3 times over. So like right now, it's not even like, well, maybe if I took some of the slower moving ones and moved them to a 3PL and move them back in later, that wouldn't even help me. And so I'm pretty much out of the water being able to send anything in for the foreseeable future. But the way I look at it is recent history has taught us Amazon sometimes has to react and they will fix it. And so if you go to the next slide, we'll show you a little bit more of kind of what's happening in that, Amazon is, I think they're just doing the best they can. And sometimes what I've noticed in my now almost 6 years selling on Amazon is that oftentimes the pendulum will swing very quickly with inventory one way. If it's almost like there's a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh my gosh, the sky's falling, we don't have enough space, whether it be with IPI scores, quantity limits on individual SKUs, or at the account level or whatever. Once they have the people and the infrastructure to accommodate sales, they don't like missing out on sales. And if some accountant bean counter somewhere is pointing out, hey, we're missing out on sales because people can't send in inventory, the pendulum swings the other way pretty quickly. And I've noticed that quite a bit with maybe 1 year to the next, like with holiday inventory limits or IPI scores or whatever. If they notice they create too much of an incentive one direction, they bring it back. And so right now I think it's pretty far on one direction in Canada, but it will get back. And so on that next slide, you'll see that this is saying that basically they're going through some challenges in the Bolton, Ontario region, which this is right outside of Toronto, where basically you might have inventory that's just processing because they have very limited staff right now. That my understanding is it's kind of like there's more of like a social distancing element and all this stuff with, they're trying to follow local health guidelines. So when you kind of read between the lines, they're doing the best that they can. But when things do get better, and they will, recent history has also told us things do get better. Amazon's not a company that's just going to leave sales on the table. They're not doing this to be punitive to sellers or to make us mad. It's, they're trying to figure things out and we're playing in their sandbox. So sometimes we just have to kind of play along with the sandbox. This will get resolved relatively quickly. And if anything, I think this teaches us more of why you should geographically diversify. Like, so for me last year, my products are very giftable. During the time in the US where I couldn't send in products and nobody could leave their house, basically there was, let's say from late March to late April of 2020, my US sales were down 80% year over year, because in my niche was very giftable. So if you're not going to see your friends, at least it seemed like in the US, you probably weren't going to give them presents. If you weren't going to see your coworkers, you probably weren't going to give them gifts. I was still making very strong sales in Canada and the UK. And so I think this is exactly why you should launch into Canada, because again, they will fix this and long-term things will get better. And I don't even, if I was to bet, and we could wager, I've got a few bucks here with me. We can wager, and I'm going to venture to say that probably by the end of the summer, this will all be resolved, because they're going to want a very healthy Q4. They're not going to want this to not work in Q4. I've even seen support tickets for clients that I've tried to go to bat for to get them more inventory, and Amazon's basically saying no. But basically, one of their rationales is they're going to have more space available by Q4. So like they're eyeing this, and they're going to make sure that they're set up and ready to go by Q4, because they're not going to allow this to happen long term. So I think this is more reason why, if you're not, to now rinse and repeat, that if you're not in Europe, you should also go to Europe. If you're not in someplace like Japan, you should maybe consider it. Japan's a whole different animal. If you're not in Australia, consider going to Australia. Australia is very simple to set up, but it's maybe about 20 to 25% of the Canadian sales for a lot of sellers, sometimes even less. It's pretty slow. Australia, oftentimes the sales are still higher in eBay in Australia, just because Australia is still a relatively new marketplace. I want to say it's only like about 3 years old, whereas Canada is a very mature marketplace. Japan's a very mature marketplace. The UK is a very mature marketplace. Germany is a mature marketplace. So start focusing on these mature marketplaces, see where you have the best potential. And another reason is too, I think that a place like Canada and Europe and UK are all good places to look, because you can pick your favorite tool that you might use for selecting the whatchamacallit, the potential product demand, and you're going to find that you can get at least some semblance of what it might look like, because those tools will work throughout North America and throughout Europe, but they don't work in the Pacific. So random side note. So then on the next slide, what I wanted to just point out is a couple things. So there's a game I used to play. And so Americans, especially if they're around my age, maybe from their late 30s to mid to late 40s, I'm in my mid 40s. I used to play a game called the Oregon Trail. And so basically what it is it was on an Apple computer. Like literally I'd have to swap out floppy disks in between. So in case anybody remembers floppy disks. But the point of this game was you went from, let's say, Kansas in the middle of the US to the West, which was Oregon. And you're fighting off, that you might get cholera or typhoid fever, diseases I've never even heard of except for in this game. And then you try to like do these crazy things on this, very basic computer graphics. But the point was you're trying to go from point A to point B. I used to think of it that way. What I've come to learn which we'll point out here in the next slide, is entrepreneurship is not a point A to point B game. It is more like these games where you just keep adding on and adding on and adding on. And the more you add on, the more things compound, because you're getting more results back within the game, whether it's SimCity or Minecraft or Roller Coaster Typhoon. All these little games, you add on more things and then more money comes to you, and then you can invest more into more things, and then more money comes back to you, or whatever the points or results are in that game. So I look at entrepreneurship, especially e-commerce, that same way. The international growth is another way to add a factory or a roller coaster or a fort or whatever it is, or a plot of land to make carrots or whatever it is in the game you're playing. If you have that mindset that you're looking at this as a game of adding on to your board, to your empire, international is a great way to do that. And so Canada, I think, is definitely one folks should consider adding on there. And that's basically the gist of, my thought processes here. So I guess I can open it up to some questions.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Let's take a look at the poll to see where where people viewing today. So 60% have said no, but we're planning on it. So that's today's a really good place to start. One who's saying yes, and the remaining no, and without any intention to. So I'm pleased for the people who voted no with no intention to, that they've got to the end of the end of this webinar and perhaps changed their mind. But
right.
Look, I'd like to start, if I could. There are some
Sure.
questions that would like to get from guests as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to talk a little bit about the tax registration, and whether or not that's the submission of those taxes are handled typically by a third-party agency, or whether or not, like Amazon sellers typically do in the UK, whether there's any Amazon scheme, or whether you'd recommend that people do that themselves.
So, again, my non-tax prepare, non-legal advice, which I won't call advice, but my thoughts, I'll say it that way. You fill out a form, and then once a year, you got to fill out another online form. It's pretty simple. It's like 6 boxes you got to check out. I've had people do it. In fact, not for last year's, but the year before, I had a professional do the taxes for me. I calculated it ahead of time because I wanted to see if they came up with the same number I did, and they did. And so this year, when I did the taxes for 2020, I actually just started taking screenshots, and I just put it up on my YouTube channel and said, "Hey, if this helps you, here's the mechanics." Of course, make sure everyone understands their own unique situation. But I would say it's one of those things that, like, I tend to say don't do taxes on your own, even if it's simple, because it can be complex. But this is one I think, like, literally we're talking about one form you have to fill out once a year. And so you just pull out like a couple reports. I have a virtual assistant that, will add some numbers for me, like get the invoices that I need from Amazon to be able to get credit for what I pay on FBA fees. But it tends to be pretty simple. And of the video I put on how to do a GST filing on YouTube, people generally have told me that it was helpful enough for them to do it on their own. So I would say it's up to you. And if you don't want to spend the time to do it, hire someone. There's plenty of opportunities. I've got a couple people. If somebody was like, "Hey, who could do my taxes for me?" I've got 2 options for you that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, so that's cool. I mean, typically when sellers come to Europe, because the complexities of lots of different countries, lots of different tax registrations, different thresholds for registering for taxes, it's very typical to use use an agency for that. Moving on then to you talked a lot about things going directly into FBA. And index numbers and things, an inventory situation. What about 3PL? We had a client approach us yesterday about 3PL. We, of course, for a European operation, don't really have an enormous amount of choice. Unless you have small items you can send in directly to FBA in Germany and the UK. Typically, a 3PL standing point is the way forward. Is that less common for the Canadian market?
I think it's becoming more common nowadays because even though, like, let's say my account, I pointed out the 200, for some new products, it might be 20 units they can send in.
Wow.
And so, yeah, it's pretty crazy. Now, when you first start out in any marketplace, the marketplace has to get a little bit used to the algorithm, I should say, gets a little used to your product. So over time, you will sell more. So in the beginning, you tend to sell less than you would ongoing. So 3PLs are becoming more important, I think, just because if anything, you're going to pay some brokerage fee at the border. So if you're sending in, 3 different products and you can send in 20 units of each, that's 60 units. It may not be worth your while to just send in 60 units. For some people, they might say, sure, I'll just do that to test it out. But oftentimes it's worth it to get with the 3PL. So that way you could have it stored and say, hey, can you go ahead and send it in? And if they're in, let's say, the Toronto area, and they send it into the Toronto area fulfillment centers, as long as it gets checked in quickly, you could have inventory back in stock in a couple days.
Okay. And before I open it out to everyone, I have one more question that I'd got from listening to your talk, which was amazing. Thank you. What about you talked a little bit about the competition and said that the competition in Amazon.ca was less brutal than in the US.
Yes.
Can you kind of quantify that for for people? Is it half as much? Is it what does that look like?
Yeah, it's hard to say because there's no statistics of that. But here's one thing I will mention. So for fun, anyone that's selling in the US, look up your product in Canada. You're probably going to find somebody who's already selling it. And people freak out about this all the time, where it might be, let's say, 2.5 to 3 times the price of what you're selling it in the US, even accounting for the difference in currency. And the crazy part about that is what they're really doing is there's a bot might go and scrape like 1 million listings in the US, add them into the Canadian marketplace, And then if it was purchased, all they're going to do is purchase from your US listing. If you go page 1, sometimes they're on there, sometimes page 2 or 3 for some products, you might see some of these what Amazon refers to as gray listings, where let's say everything else is around $20 and a comparable product you see is like selling for like 70. Like it doesn't make sense why it would be so expensive, other than for whatever reason an FBM product shipping, which is listed as shipping from the US, at a ridiculous price, is still making it into relatively high rankings, is also indicative of, oh, there's not as much competition as there would have been. Because as we all know, Amazon favors for ranking and buy box products that are local inventory in FBA that are, reasonably priced. And so when it's not FBA, not local to the country, and crazy prices, and it's still getting some ranking, that's a good sign. And even if that's not happening, one thing to keep in mind too is there's a lot of products out there that are NARF, so it's called the North American Remote Fulfillment Program. And so Amazon, because I think because they really want to make the catalog bigger in Canada, they went to a lot of sellers, and it's almost open to just about everybody at this point. But for a while, it was only a certain level, where basically you could have your products that are in US fulfillment centers shipped to customers in Canada, and you didn't have to register. Well, that sounds great. Well, there's no free lunch. Someone's paying somewhere along the way. So the customer is paying by having to pay duties. The customer is having to pay more expensive shipping. The seller is oftentimes paying for more expensive fulfillment fees. But even aside from the fulfillment fees of the seller, the fact the customer has to wait longer and has to pay more, or they can get something that's going to magically show up a day or two later. If you're the customer and you don't have to pay extra and it's Prime and gets right to you, which are you going to get? And so NARF tends to not have anywhere near as much sales. And so also if you can, it's harder to tell sometimes the NARF ones, but if you can tell that there's NARF listings that ship from the US, that those oftentimes will also be indicative of, if they're ranking halfway decent, they're probably not getting great sales. And so that's another indication of you're not in as competitive of a niche. And I tend to I don't know of anyone that does, aggressive launch tactics in Canada.
Okay, that's very cool. That's a really good way of kind of putting it into a kind of tactile way that you can go and check.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that. Let's open this to the floor.
Sure.
Question from Tate Hancock. Tate, thank you very much. I'm already selling to Canada through Amazon North American Unified Act. Was that the NARF?
Well, so there's the North American United accounts
Unified
where
account,
basically, it's kind of the standard. You already have Mexico and Canada when you set up a US account.
Okay. Tate's saying the problem is that most of my products won't publish the inventory to the Amazon.ca side, and Amazon's been no help. Do you suggest shipping directly to Canada instead of doing a unified account?
Yeah, it sounds like this person is in NARF. And so because Amazon generally doesn't like to be involved in cross-border transactions. So just as like the UK is now a completely different country than the rest of the European Union, it's always been that way between the US and Canada. And so Amazon tends to shy away from that. So with NARF, they kind of opened that up a little bit, but it's they tend to find a lot of reasons why they, I think, don't want to be involved in, because now you're exporting out of one country and importing into another, even if it's just an individual product. So I would say for the purposes of long-term making more sales and having more products to be available for sale, I would definitely recommend getting out of NARF. And if you're getting some sales out of NARF, that's a good sign, because customers, again, will pay, or you'll get more sales because the customer's not having to pay for the customer's costs and inconveniences with NARF.
Okay, Tate, I hope that answers your question. Another question from Kishore Patel. Thank you, Kishore, for your question. Is there a requirement to have a legal entity formed in Canada?
Yeah, great question. And generally speaking, no. And so if you just look up in, we'll say GST non-resident office in Google, there's 3 offices that you can register in that handle depending on where you live geographically. So you can just look up either the state you live in if you're US based, or the country you're in if you're outside of the US, and it'll tell you as a non-Canadian resident which office to go to, because these offices, all they do is focus on companies outside of Canada and getting them registered.
Okay, sure. I hope that answers. So that just about wraps things up. What were we? 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for sort of for staying with us. Let's maybe exchange some contact details in case any other questions pop up after the broadcast, or if anyone wants to get in touch. I'm of course open and very ready to help any e-commerce seller with their expansion journey, specifically into Europe. And all my contact details that you can see there, or please do link with me on LinkedIn if you want to find out more about what we're doing at GE. And of course our Instagram and Facebook channels. We've also got some details for Kevin's Kevin's YouTube channel and podcasts. That's that one there, is it?
Yeah. So if you want, I've got the steps outlined of how to launch into Canada. If you go to canadachecklist.com, you can opt in to get the checklist sent to you, as well as you can always follow me, Maximizing E-commerce, on YouTube and whatever your favorite podcast locations are. And feel free to email Kevin at maximizingecommerce.com if you have specific questions. I love answering questions. So I didn't come up with this saying on my own. I'm borrowing this from someone, but if you send me a thoughtful question, I'll give you a thoughtful response.
Well, that's a great way to end. Kevin, thank you so much for your input. Thank you so much for enlightening us on what really is an exciting opportunity to add to the mega portfolio of exciting opportunities that come in e-commerce. So every day is a new exciting opportunity in e-commerce. So appreciate your time, and to everybody listening, thank you so much for taking the time to watch today. And we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar in the future. Thank you very much, and good day.